This is Book TV's Afterwards podcast. Each week, a top nonfiction author is interviewed by a journalist, public policy maker, legislator, or others familiar with their work. We post the podcast every Sunday. Subscribe and never miss an episode. This week, our guest is Jennifer Steinhauer. She's author of the book, The Firsts, the inside story of women reshaping Congress. She's interviewed by first-term Congresswoman Chrissy Houlahan, Democrat of Pennsylvania.
So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to have this conversation with you today because I have not a terribly good memory, to be honest. And so this last year has been kind of a blur for me, a year and a half. And so I'm really grateful that you took the time to write down so many of the stories that I frankly have lived in the last year and a half. So what inspired you to write this book?
You know, my editor of this book called me right after the election and said, oh my gosh, you know, we have this record number of women in Congress and such an interesting mix of women in Congress, so many firsts for so many different districts and for Congress, period. Don't you think that'd be a great book? And you've covered Congress over the years. I'd love you to do it, and you have, 6 months or something.
Yeah.
It was killer deadline. And I thought, great, that'll be great. I mean, this is going to be all new people. And I had the experience of covering when the Republicans took over and the Tea Party wave and what that was like to have a whole new breed in town. So I thought, wow, they're kind of bookends.
That's a really interesting contrast. And from, your book, you tell a lot of stories, many of them personal to me. What ones stand out to you as being the most remarkable stories that you would, if you had coffee with somebody, that you would want to share with them about our class or this year?
I think there's a couple things. I always loved sitting in the gallery and watching all of you interact to see who sits with whom and who hangs out. And I did find the group of national security women, as they're often referred to, so close and so tight-knit, and kind of watching you had this sort of bonding experience. And with the men as well, but watching that was really interesting to me. I think another just kind of legislative memory that really sticks out for all kinds of reasons was that vote on the background check bill, the Lucy McBath bill. For a lot of reasons, just that she had run on that issue, having had such a painful, horrific experience of losing her child to gun violence, which then drove her into the political arena. And so many personal stories did drive women, such as yourself, into politics, which was such a theme of that election. A bill that obviously had not gotten any traction in Congress in the last decade, to see it passed, then to see the contrast of the moderates and the progressives and fighting over the amendments to that. And that was unfolding right in front of us. And that's chronicled that moment in the book. And I followed Congresswoman McBath from her hearing to the floor as she was getting ready to vote on that bill. And that will just always stick out to me as the intersection of the personal and the political, and something that really demonstrated in so many ways what this Congress has been about.
And that really was an important bill, a couple decades that we hadn't voted on or considered any sort of legislation about guns and gun safety. And it was a really personal issue for Lucy in particular. And as I recall in the book, you told a bit of a story about the motion to recommit that was associated with that. And I think that's one of the things that, from a memory standpoint, strikes me as what this year and a half has been about for me and my learning experience. There's a concept or an actual thing called a motion to recommit, which basically gets appended to every bill of any consequence that gets voted on in Congress. And it has its history being something that's sort of the last bite at the apple from the party that's in the minority to be able to perfect the bill, so that theoretically, if we just had this happen on this motion to recommit, then everything would be perfect in the bill as a whole, and we would be able to pass it bipartisanly. That's sort of the heritage of this concept. But the MTR has become instead a weapon of the party of the minority in a lot of ways, and it's become something that can be used, frankly, to run attack ads on the party in the majority and specific members of the party in the majority. And this was one of the things that was most striking to me as a person who was a freshman, but not only a freshman, but a first-time legislator, that there are these kinds of weapons, or at this point in time, that seem to be almost like your appendix, not necessary any longer. And that was something that I was really struck by in Congress. Another thing I was struck by, and you wrote a little bit about it, was freshman orientation as having been largely not with a lot of content. And so I thought that was interesting too. And I was wondering for you, when I went to college, there was an essay that stands out in my mind, which was, in one word, if you could describe yourself, what would that one word be? So if you could describe our freshman class, what would you think that one word would be, and why would you use that word?
I would say remarkable, because on the one hand, if you look at the fact that it's the most number of women, and yet it's still so few. When I interviewed Congresswoman Pat Schroeder about this, she said, well, I don't even know what we're celebrating here. We're not even a quarter. So it's striking both in its absence of a larger number, but that it exists, right? And then the diversity, as I mentioned earlier. And as we talk about the motion to recommit, which only on C-SPAN can we have such a lengthy conversation about this. And I think it's such an important, fascinating thing. And for me, having stood in the speaker's lobby when the Republicans in control and the Democrats would do one, and that's when the Republicans, a lot of the guys would go out and smoke cigars out on the balcony. You know, it just wasn't a thing anyone paid attention to. And watching how something like that's symbolic or has become anachronistic at this point, to be revived as part of a political conversation in a sense, and watching, I think that what was remarkable too, besides the fact that you had all these very interesting backgrounds, was that you let your experiences and the newness of it, you let that unfold pretty openly. I don't think people really tried to hide the fact. In fact, it was, and for many people, obviously, a badge of honor to have not been in politics, especially in Washington, and to let your newness to it and frankly your fresh opinions on how things should be done, even when it didn't work out in your favor. And you talked about that motion to recommit again. I was talking to Angie Craig from Minneapolis suburbs in a coffee shop there, and she said, I kind of regretted that. I realized only after the fact what that actually did. So she's learning, and she's open. You know, everyone is learning in front of the country, and I think that's very different than 10 years ago.
I think it's really important. Transparency is really important. It's particularly important to me, and I think a lot of my freshman class members, because we did just get here in a lot of ways. We do have fresh and clean legislative records. We are trying to be thoughtful and deliberate with our processes and making sure that we not only are, you know, hopefully representing people, but explaining why we believe that we're representing the people in whatever vote that we take. And so it is important also to be human. I think that's one thing that I hope that you see in a class with more women in it, is that we're trying to be more our whole selves in terms of how we present to people. And I think that's different than some of the women who may have run before us in terms of how they felt like that they had to present to people. They didn't necessarily feel like that they could be their whole selves. And I think my next question here is, you did spend a lot of time kind of talking about people figuring out whether or not to run, how to run, whether they were recruited or not recruited. I as an example, was not recruited. I literally hit reply to an Emily's List email solicitation and attached my resume and said I'd like to run for Congress. And my, literal reply went to info@emilyslist.com, and I didn't think at all that anybody would ever answer me out in the ether and in the universe. And they did, for whatever reason, I think because I was earlier on in the process. And also, I got a lot of questions early on of, why are you not running for school board? Why are you not, starting with state or local? And, my response to folks at that time was, hey, I'm 51 and I'm too old for that. And not only that, but I'm qualified. And I got kind of a response back, a tepid response back of, who are you to think that you're qualified, without having any other qualifications in government? And I don't think we would have had those conversations and those kinds of responses with male candidates. And I think that's something that I'd like to understand. What do you think the differences are between men and women in running for office? Do you think that this is a class that wasn't necessarily recruited, or a large part of us were recruited? Kind of what did you see in the landscape of all of us?
It was a mix. It's funny when you're reflecting upon how you got into the race and talking about qualifications. I go back to that class of 87 freshmen in the 2011 Congress, and one of them I spent a lot of time was he had a pizzeria, and that was his family business. And he went, and I don't think anybody said why. I think they said, how do you think you're going to beat this incumbent Democrat? But I don't think that he was laughed out of town because of with regards to experience. And again, that's become a badge of honor in Washington, to be down with the people, to be, know your constituents, to go home a lot. So if you're talking to a woman and saying, do you have enough experience? that's automatically a different standard, right? If your standard is to be a part of your community, a citizen lawmaker, if you will. It is very interesting, and I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on Elizabeth Warren dropping out, which is today on Thursday, because that's obviously a huge piece of the conversation. And there's just there is no getting around these almost reflexive responses to women, and frankly, let's be honest, often from other women.
Absolutely.
I had a lot of women, especially there's a chapter in the book about Republican women, and they talk about what you're talking about, and people saying, well, who's going to watch your kids? Martha Roby from Alabama, who's retiring, told me people would constantly say, who's going to take care of your kids while you're in Washington and you're on the road? These questions just come up all the time, and all I can say is, my conclusion is that in order to combat that, you just need more women. Now, when women can get through a primary, they will get elected, but they have to get through the primary, and I think you see that's where a lot of that starts.
Yeah, and I was struck by the parts of your book that reflected on the Republican women experience versus the Democratic women experience, and that there were some differences that you assessed. I share with you kind of the joy when I look at our side of the aisle, the Democratic side of the aisle, and the diversity and the camaraderie and just sort of the color, literally the color, because women tend to, not wear suits. And so you just see this kind of tapestry of America. And then when I look to the other side of the aisle, and largely I see more somber, suits and mostly men. And I want that other side of the aisle to look like America. I want the other side to be more bright. And, what comments did you make in the book that had to do with, the Republican, why can't we get more Republican women elected?
I know that when I talk to many people in Washington and elsewhere, they don't believe me when I say this, and it's probably not universally enthusiastically so. I truly believe, in having covered Congress and talked to so many people in Congress and written this book, Republicans do want that too, especially women. They do want more women. They do want a more diverse Congress. Now, structurally speaking, the way that they have normally recruited people and supported people, which has to do with their overall political philosophy, has to do, their meritocracy, that they want to be gender neutral and race neutral and so forth, and just always pick the best person. And I think Republican women in particular, especially those who are in the fundraising space and the recruitment space, are starting to really come around to the view, they did with me certainly in reporting the book, that was just simply not going to work, that there had to be a gender focus on recruiting women, often because, as we all know, women often, many women have to be asked to run. In fact, they have to be talked into running sometimes, even when they're highly qualified, more qualified than a male incumbent or challenger. So if that's the case with women, you are going to have to recruit women directly. And, I talked to a woman who had run in a primary in North Carolina, and she was stunned to see how many women, especially I think over 50, who didn't believe that another woman should have woman should have that job. So it's some of that's very regional, but it's really it's going to take concerted effort. I think it's just not going to say we want more women. Hey, come on and run. There have to be structural changes in place for that.
I know that for me, in my particular case, not only, of course, am I a woman, but I'm also a veteran, and I'm also an engineer, and I'm also an educator, and all of those different kinds of things are not very well represented in our Congress. And they're largely not really represented, and you just touched on it, because access to capital is the lifeblood of politics, sadly. And people who are veterans or educators or women or educators are not those people who have vast networks of people who can support them and can, provide resources for their campaigns and that sort of thing. And so I think we are in a new time where there are increasingly more and more organizations who are recognizing that. And there are some on the Democratic side that support women, Emily's List amongst others. There are some on the Republican side that support women as well. I think there are also some that are coming up that are supporting STEM professionals, people with engineering backgrounds, or veterans of one side or the other. And so I think we are making some reforms there that are allowing the better access to candidates that are not traditional candidates who didn't come through politics or didn't come up as lawyers, as an example. And so I think that we are creating pathways for that. Of course, I think that it would be better if we had a system where we funded campaigns that wasn't about access to capital, so that it could have a more level playing field, and that so more people could be encouraged to run on both sides of the aisle. I thought it was interesting that you did spend some time on Shirley Chisholm and Patsy Mink, and I thought that was really fascinating. Did you see any parallels between that conversation and today's members?
In some ways, the history chapter was really interesting for me. I learned a lot, obviously. What really struck me was the sexism, and some of it quite just gross, was so much more prevalent in the 70s, and I really wanted to labor to understand that. And it was because so many of the early women in Congress took their dead husband's seats. And they were really viewed by their male colleagues as adjuncts. Many of them worked on their husbands' campaigns, had worked in their district offices and so forth. It's like, oh, Lucy's okay because that's Jerry's wife, And so there wasn't really a huge number of women asserting themselves with their own agency the way there was, except with the first woman, Jeanette Rankin, who, when she showed up in town, everyone wanted her lemon pie recipe, So it's always been uphill. That I'm going to make her lemon pie, by the way, for Women's History Month. I'm really excited to do that. But the 70s, as women began to run on their own, that was when they were really pushing back and the men were really upset. And that is also worth noting, a period when women in both parties came together in the Women's Caucus to really try to have some legislative muscle behind the scenes, because they really weren't on all the good committees. They certainly didn't hold gavels and things like that. And they put a lot of ideological arguments off the table and worked on things they could agree on. And that was a much more bipartisan time for women in Congress. And so this class, I think, it's very interesting that the Me Too movement was happening in the background of all of this, because that's not the same as women coming through the women's movement and getting elected in large numbers. It's not quite the same context, but there are some similarities in terms of what's going on nationally, what's happening in our culture, and women reflecting that, and women from different backgrounds who would never usually be considered for public office, certainly in a federal office, coming up and deciding to run and getting elected. And I think those are where I saw some parallels.
You mentioned the spouses of dead Congresspeople, men. Pennsylvania has only ever had 7 elected women before this cycle. Actually, 7 women total, and I think 4 of them were the spouses or the wives of former members of Congress. So only 3 women in history in Pennsylvania had been elected in their own name until this 2018 election, and now we have 4. So we went from having no women in Pennsylvania at the time that I was elected to having 4.
And the fabulous 4, I believe. The
Fab 4, exactly. And I remember having a conversation, and you include this in the book, with a donor, a woman, a lawyer who had been around for a while, and she was talking to me about being supportive of my campaign and my candidacy, but basically pleading and begging with me that if she was going to support me, that I would commit, that I would not, leave this Congress unless I felt that there was a stability in the Pennsylvania, caucus for women, that Pennsylvania had this kind of heritage of having only 1 woman at a time, and that was pretty much our limit. And now we do have 4. And so I think we are collectively committed to making sure that this isn't some sort of an aberration and that it's some sort of permanence as well. You did write something in the book that says, once in Congress, no one wants to lose. And for centrists, every day is borrowed time. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic and how it's played out in the last year, particularly for the women members? Yes,
we're seeing this, and so we're seeing some mirror of that, right, in the primary for the White House, the Democratic primary. The House, it's remarkable to me how many people in the country who are very excited about having this many women in Congress, or Democrats who are excited about Democrats taking back the House, really struggle with the concept of how that occurred. And how it occurred was Democrats beating some Republicans. And how did that happen? It did not happen with the most liberal members, the most progressive members. And yet the focus of the Democratic Party, whether it's criticizing them or embracing them, has been to focus on the progressive element. And the notion that the party itself is organically moving to the left. And there is some research to back that up. But right now, if you look at how people are voting, and we see what's going on in the Democratic primary, in fact, if you want to attract centrists and some Republicans, which is a coalition you need to win certainly the White House, and in some districts where it's more Republicans or equal numbers, you're going to need that coalition to win a House seat too. You can't be embracing the most progressive positions, and probably naturally you wouldn't be because you're running it in that district. And that tension of where some of the most progressive faces and the more prominent faces of that election, obviously we know who we're talking about, particularly Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who are kind of presenting the Bernie part of the party, if you will. Bernie Sanders has done very well in this primary. He's one of the last people standing. There's no question there's a large segment of the party that is there with him. But that's not the growing section as per se right now, and it's certainly not the only part of the party. And when you're in divided government to boot, with any hope of getting anything done, that sense that you can only do things, progressive legislation, or you're not a real Democrat, I watch that vex these moderates who are saying, not only do I want to hold my seat, but that's the only way you're going to keep the House. And that tension never seemed to fully become resolved from what I could see. And the women were, of course, the backbone a lot of those races.
Yeah, and yes, in my particular district, I have hold a seat that is the vast majority of it is a county called Chester County, and Chester County has been red for more than 160 years. And my community is 40% Democrats and 40% Republicans and 20% independents. And we are a very purple place. And I think I am one of those people that you're mentioning in terms of the race that I was able to, the House seat that I was able to flip, really being kind of one of those pragmatic purple places. And something that I hope that women bring to the table, and veterans as well, is the understanding that you're all part of the same team. And honestly, across the aisle, you're all part of the same team. We're all patriots. We're all part of this solution. And, whether we're red or blue or purple, I think it's really important that we recognize that we're there to represent the 700,000 or so folks that are in our communities. And hopefully we were brought there because we represent those people. And so I might not be the same person as Alexandria is. I might not be the same person as somebody who's, from a red district that I'm not from, but that's okay because that's our job. We're there to try and find the common ground and to try and come together. And one of the things that I try to explain to people in my mind is that it's not this sort of linear spectrum of red and blue. It's this circle. And in my opinion, the blue and the red, the hard blue and the hard red, come together at the very top of that. And that's when you see some interesting coalitions that happen at the very top, sure, because they're in some ways more similar than they know they are. And then down in the purple area, you also have some synergies going on, particularly in this Congress, where you've got a lot of veterans in the purple parts because they flipped seats. You've got a lot of strong reds and strong blues, and things like authorized use of military force is a great example where we might have the opportunity to have real conversations because we're representing our communities and because we come from different places. So I think it's really cool.
Well, and also too, how we define what's liberal and what's moderate has changed so much. And the most compelling example to me is the notion of the public option. Now it's an anthem with progressives not to support Medicare for all. Many people don't. They prefer a public option. The public option has now become the squish position for Democrats. But let's not forget, 10 years ago, that was considered very far left. People lost their seats over that. So we don't think of the public option now as a left-wing policy concept at all. But that wasn't 30 years ago. That was 10 years ago. So I think just sometimes how we define people, too, could be, we could complicate that.
Absolutely. So switching topics to something that's a little bit more fun, I laughed that you included the part about the member orientation because I found it to be kind of a frustrating experience. During freshman orientation, we literally had different buses for Democrats and Republicans. We spent a lot of time focused on things that were very HR-ish, which of course you'd expect in an orientation, but very little on things like what is an MTR, and why should we care about it, or very little about how do you get something through appropriations. And that's, largely because I think we had a huge class of people who needed to have that background where I would have thought that would have been helpful. But, you've been here for a while, and so you probably have seen a couple things that I haven't seen. What do you think the weirdest thing is about Congress? When you go out of the Beltway to talk to people about us, I talk about the MTR. I think that's the weirdest thing. Is there something that you can think of?
In some ways, I think what continues to strike me, and, a lot of people who cover Congress have been in Washington a long time. I had a little bit of an unusual background because I had spent most of my career in New York City, and then I was Los Angeles bureau chief, and I came here. I wasn't a Washington reporter. So in some ways, I was a freshman, right? These things were very new to me. I hadn't spent any time on Capitol Hill. And what struck me then, and which I enjoyed watching members interact with is really more the bizarre physical nature of the Capitol and how you go about things. Just the amount of walking. I can't tell you how many conversations I have with women about their need to buy new shoes and the way that the footwear issue. It's huge, right? The amount of walking that goes on. The funny little antiquated things, the mail slots, and there's a rotary phone, as you've probably noticed, in one of the member elevators. The fact that members are still called to votes with these buzzes and these bells, and you have to know that. And there was a time way back when senators, before that process, would be eating oysters and drinking champagne, and their aides would have to come by and tell them, "Hey, Senator, it's time to vote." So some of those things are gone. We don't have oysters in the rotunda as we
not
used
that
to.
I'm aware of,
no,
no.
not anymore. But in some ways, it's a very formal place still. I mean, you must know that right before you came to Congress, there was an actual live debate about whether women could expose their shoulders on the House floor, and this extended to the Speaker's lobby off of the House floor. So there's something sort of funny, antiquated, formal. Perhaps needlessly so, but then sometimes charmingly so. I think people, until they get into that workspace, kind of can't even imagine. I'd be curious if that was your experience.
No, I mean, I share when I'm back home, I sometimes teach AP government classes or kind of classes to college and high school and grade school kids about like what the day in the life of a congressperson is. What do I do all day? And one of the slides that I show them is, my not my Fitbit because I don't have one, but my phone because I'm dragging it with me everywhere. And on most days I'm walking between 6 and 8 miles a day. And that's just a typical day. And on most days I'm only in my office maybe 10 or 15 minutes a day because largely what I'm doing is all over the Congress. And one of the things that I found enlightening is, and ironically we're here on C-SPAN to talk about it, which is I never understood why nobody ever seemed to be at work in Congress.
Right.
Because I'd be watching the television and I'd say, where is everybody? The seats are empty. And what I discovered is they're all on 3 or 4 different committees and 6 or 7 subcommittees, and they're all happening at the very same time. And so when I'm, as an outsider, looking in and looking at those empty seats, what I'm not recognizing is that member is walking around the 8 miles of their day,
right.
To sit in their chair for their 5 minutes of conversation, to represent their community. And that largely what they're doing is then bringing back information to their teams, to their staffs, to be able to work on legislative items or agendas. And that was a real eye-opener for me because I really did genuinely think, where is everybody and why are they not at work?
I tried to convey in the book, people have a lot of these preconceptions about members, and, maybe some of them are true. Maybe members of Congress have a little bit bigger egos than your average person because they think they can run, or maybe they have these different kinds of quirks, but they're not lazy.
Mm-hmm.
They're not lazy. I mean, these are hard-working people. When they go home for recess, that's not a recess. They're running from, one 4-H club meeting to meet with a mayor, to meet with the constituents. I had one member, I think it was Sharice Davids, who told me that sometimes she has people come to her house on Sunday if she can't get to them while she's at home over the weekend. So that's a lot of work, and I think you're right. That is something people really just don't get about Congress.
One of my classmates and my new classmates, Jared Golden up in Maine, he, not exaggerating, brings a 6-pack and knocks on somebody's door up. He just sits down and has a beer with them, and that's kind of what he does sometimes on the weekend. But you're right. I also, am home in our community, and I hear on NPR, Congress is in recess, and I hate that expression because that everybody's back home in their communities, working really hard to be present at home when they're not here in Washington, D.C. What do you think that is, speaking of all of this kind of visual, cues of whether you're there or not there, what is the biggest difference between what you see in the media and what is actually happening here on the ground?
2 things strike me, and they're kind of contradictory. And one I think is really important for people to understand is that there is no question that there are ideological divides in Congress, and people come down to the floor, and some of it is performative, but some of it is extremely heartfelt, those debates. Some of them are very personal in certain circumstances, and I think women have brought that to the table in the past couple decades, making policy very personal, talking about their constituents, their own experiences, and the way people feel about legislation is heartfelt and true and meaningful. And there is some true acrimony, there's no question. But I think what people don't understand is how much people kind of basically get along. You know, you get in a member elevator, you go into the escalator, or you watch people, Republicans and Democrats, they mingle, they talk, even people who are very ideologically opposed. I would stand outside the speaker's lobby, again off the House floor, and watch people and who talks to whom. And it's amazing to see Democrats and Republicans who have massive policy difference, who are just yucking it up, or from the same state, talking about something they're working on together, or talking about a restaurant that they both know, because you can hear these conversations sometimes. So it's some of that acrimony, again, is performative, and some of it is genuine, but it doesn't extend to the personal relationships. And in fact, one of the conclusions I make in the book is, if you look at the entire nature of the political discourse in our country, Congress might be one of the few places where people of ideological differences actually do mix every day and get to speak their mind to each other and at each other pretty regularly.
Yeah, actually, that was one part of the book that I have a note on, because I'm seeking that. I'm a freshman, so I'm seeking friendships that are across the aisle, and I'm seeking friendships that are ideologically not my own. And that doesn't even mean that it has to be across the aisle. As to your point, it can be to my left or my far right. And what I've been struck by, and I'd love to have some hope on it from you, is I'd like it if our debates were of more substance, on the floor. So I agree with you. I see that behind the scenes. I see that in closed doors. I see that, frankly, in classified briefings where people are unfettered and they have the opportunity just to listen to the information and to ask questions that aren't necessarily going to be their 5-minute, YouTube opportunities. And so I would really love to see more substantive debate where people actually have to sit and listen, as opposed to kind of spending their time with their 5 minutes of time with 3 minutes of talking about what happened last administration, or 10 years ago, or 30 years ago. And I hope that maybe you're seeing something different than I am on my committees. But I was really struck by that conversation in the book, that I had more hope because of what you wrote in the book, that I need to look harder for that, look harder for the
It does happen. I think the Rules Committee, boy, that's a fun thing to watch. That can be very animated, but they're down in the weeds on that, too. I mean, that is televised as well, but obviously most people are not tuning into that the way they are to an impeachment hearing. So it definitely, I think, does happen. But I didn't, I guess, get to my second point there, which I said was a bit contradictory, which is it kind of reminds me when I covered Hurricane Katrina. And I would go from all the internet was knocked out in the phones, and I would go from one town, and I would go to the next town 20 miles away, and they had no idea what was going on 20 miles down the road, because they were looking to me, to what's happening down in Bogalusa. Sometimes with Republicans and Democrats, I see that reporters talk to everybody. Yeah. So then you might go to a Republican and say, hey, well, the Democrats said they're going to do such and such with this legislation, and they have no clue what you're talking about. You're a reporter. You shouldn't know more than the members do about what people on their own committee are doing. But that kind of goes back to your point about the buses and orientation. There's so little, it seems to me, mixing of the parties to actually know what each side is actually thinking and doing. Part of it for reconnaissance, probably, but also just to have those kind of conversations. So part of it, I think, may be structural, and that you'd have to address as a legislature more than anything else.
There is a new kind of temporary group that's called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, and some of the ideas that they're putting forward are about those kinds of issues, which is, I think, as an example, it would be nice if those committee hearings didn't happen all at the same time. So I wouldn't be committed to 7 subcommittee meetings within 3 hours of one another, and instead, along the lines of high school, where, I have 3 girls. I think you mentioned you have kids too. My kids are grown, but when they were in high school, they had this block schedule situation where you couldn't combine this class with that class because they had to happen at different times. And so I'd like to see that kind of modernization where we are obliged to be in our committee and to be able to hear the conversation that's going back and forth. Because when I'm able to stay in my committee hearing long enough to hear everybody's conversation, I benefit from their knowledge. I benefit from what's important to them. And I'm able to bring it back to my hive, So I'm looking for that. I'm also looking for can we not sit left and right? Can we literally, sit in a popcorn way where we're sitting next to people? I'm lucky because I'm a freshman, and so I'm probably the most junior in some cases person on some of my committees, and that necessarily means I'm sitting next to the most junior Republican as well. So I'm lucky that I actually get to sit side by side with Republicans in some of the committees, but it'd be cool if we had the opportunity to stay where we are for longer periods of time and to have to, mix it up a little bit. I think that would be helpful too. Let's see. My next question is, you talk a lot in your book about descriptive representation, which is the first time that I think I've seen that set of words put together. I'm an engineer, so forgive me if it's been around and I just don't know it. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Yes, it's actually a political science term, and I learned it too in reporting the book, so definitely you should not feel embarrassed not to know that. I certainly didn't know it. Descriptive representation means that you're a person who represents literally a specific group. It tends to be for racial and ethnic groups, but as veterans, you are, if you were in a committee representing a lot of veterans, and you're a veteran, you're representing that professional group or that particular group of people. But we do tend to think of it more in racial terms, and it's been usually used, I think, originally mostly to describe Latino lawmakers. But it's kind of interesting because I think that we think of this as being something sort of important in and of itself, and that it's nice. And that's probably true, but I think you're starting to see, I would be very curious again to hear your opinion of this, because you have an inside view that I don't, in terms of whether it actually makes a difference. I don't know, in the social interactions, I'd be very curious. I got some sense of that, but I think you do see it impacting legislation. I certainly think it's been very important. For example, Native American women, really it's extremely meaningful for them to see Native American women in office. And they've made that extremely clear. And then you also see those women working on a lot of really intense tribal issues that not only get more perhaps fuel with them, but when they go to talk about those issues, they can have those conversations. People from their own community, they know about these tribal laws, they know about some of these specific things that other people on the committee may not know about, because that's literally their whole life. So it has substantive impact, I think. I'm curious to what you think.
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, we do have a class on the Democratic side that has a lot more veterans and members who have served either in the CIA or other places than the past. Many of us serve on armed services or foreign affairs or homeland security or veterans affairs. And I think we have unique experiences, personal experiences that we're able to bring forward. For me, as an example, I'm a veteran. I'm a kind of pre-9/11 veteran. So I'm one of I think the only member of this class that served before 9/11. Mm-hmm. And I'm also, of course, a woman. And so one of the things that I was able to do early on is found the Service Women and Women's Veterans Caucus. And it would seem like we would already have a group of people who are thinking about women of service and women veterans as a caucus, but there isn't one. There hasn't been one. And so this now has 50 or so bipartisan men and women, people who've served and people who haven't served, who are now kind of coalescing around this issue of women who serve, and why this is relevant is, we're about 20% of the veteran population, women are, and service member population, and increasingly more and more, will be probably 30 or more percent by the decade. And we are 51% of the total population of the country. And so we certainly ought to be thinking about the women who serve and their entire trajectory, the arc of how are they recruited, because they're probably recruited differently than men are. How are they when they're active duty, and their issues of family. As an example, I separated partly because I didn't have access to childcare, and I couldn't figure out my way out of that problem. Once they separate, when they're reservists or when they're veterans themselves, what kind of health care issues do they have, as just an example. And I think not only does this help the woman of service and their family, but it also helps us in terms of our readiness and our preparation to make sure that we are ready to fight. And if we have struggle with making sure we have enough people in billets, and we're not looking to the women in our communities, then that's shame on us. And I think that having that perspective is really interesting and sad, almost in a way, that it took till 2020 to have somebody say, wait a minute, we need a Servicewomen and Women's Veterans Caucus. Similarly, this office started a Women in STEM caucus, science, technology, engineering, and maths. And specifically also, I wanted to add STEAM, which is when you add the arts to, the STEM professions. And again, this was one of those things that felt like kind of a no-duh. Of course, we should be talking about women in underserved and underrepresented communities being in STEM professions, but it hadn't happened before this time. And so similar to your stories with the diversity of our class in terms of more Native Americans and Native American women, those are just issues that everybody's thinking about, but if you need somebody in the body to be able to say it's not being represented, quite well enough in our communities. And that's a real challenge to figure out, how do we bring more diversity, not just of gender, but of all kinds of experience to Washington to be able to legislate on it.
The professional issues are very interesting, and I think about the veterans group, if you will, these freshmen. Obviously, you know that their decision to gather and to pen the op-ed in the Washington Post advocating for impeachment was incredibly pivotal for their colleagues who were not veterans, who were not former service members. I talked to many of them, and they said, okay, well, when I heard those women and men talk about this through the prism of their national security experience, that was impactful to me. So when you're bringing lived experiences, whether it's being part of a racial or ethnic group or a veteran or any other kind of subset of our culture, it definitely brings credibility, if you will, to those issues inside the chamber. Absolutely.
Is there anything that you see that's kind of hopeful to help heal the divides? I guess where I've shared this many times, is that I consider myself to be sort of an Eeyore. I'm kind of a glass is half empty kind of a person, and so I'm constantly trying to look for the Tiggers in the world to tell me that the glass is half full. And I'm just trying to look, when I think about the diversity of this Congress, particularly about the women, it's largely Democrats where that happened. And sadly, we lost a lot of Republican women and are losing more this time around as well. And so back to the point that you said, I can't remember who told you, why are we celebrating?
Pat Schroeder.
Yeah,
right?
Pat Schroeder, because have we really made any progress? Do you see, hope in what we're seeing in this Congress that's different than some other time?
Well, you should probably know reporters are the terrible place to look for Tiggers. But we're just trained against that almost. Well, it may not be considerably good news for your party, but I do know, in terms of, if you're talking about gender balance, Republican women, there's a huge effort to recruit more women this cycle. Okay. And we'll see what happens with the primaries. That's where women generally, particularly Republican women, really run into troubles with primaries. But I think that thinking cap is on with that group, and you may see more women in that party, and you may see more women, period, in the next Congress. I think that the struggle is still really, and again, this is fresh of mind because of Elizabeth Warren, the struggle still remains at the top in some ways, right? That the country kind of has to see someone elected in those top tier positions and sort of battle test that. You wouldn't think so. I mean, if you look at Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State and all the things that she did, and as a U.S. Senator, you wouldn't necessarily think that people have to wonder. And I'm not advocating specifically on behalf of Hillary Clinton, and she had her own, obviously, enormous set of issues going into that race. But it's harder to, I think, frame it for down ballot when people don't see that. It just would be enormously helpful. But having said that, within Congress, I think that it's funny. At some point, one of the more senior women said to me, one of the men are starting to grumble. We're getting sick of hearing all about these women. I mean, they were feeling that it was complicated because they were made to understand this was something for them to celebrate, but at the same time, they were having to struggle with really seeing some of their power removed and their own numbers reduced. And that's probably going to take a generation of men, I have to say, to sort of embrace these changes and to encourage more women to run. I would imagine where things may change a bit.
Well, I'm speaking about Tiggers. I can report that some of my freshman colleagues, male colleagues, and I won't name them by name, really are those men that you're looking for. They are evolved and thoughtful and working hard to change the face permanently of all of not just Congress, but business and all those other places. And one of my colleagues in particular, we joke because whenever we sit in hearings, we look across at the folks who are testifying, and largely, when you look across the aisle, it's largely men, largely white men. And so I had started in my early days of my term asking the question, gentlemen, look to your left, look to your right. Look behind you. What's wrong with this picture, and how can we make it so that the next time that I sit in front of you all, it looks a little different. And some of my colleagues, male colleagues, have started to take up that question on behalf of me. So they, will text each other, and I'll say, it's your turn, to ask that question, because I think it helps when it doesn't come from, a woman all the time. So we're working, I think, collectively, and it's actually part of that, the veteran group that we're working on having those conversations more collaboratively.
Well, that reflects the culture at large, right? I mean, I think this is part of the conversation that people call it. They use the term allies, right? And you look at this, again, a younger generation of men are just, a lot of them are leading in different ways and interacting different ways in the workplace. I think about, you triggered a thought in my brain about paternity leaves. And I see so many men, I'm Generation X, and I see so many millennial men just taking for granted that not only can they do that, but that they should do that. And I remember there was a male colleague at one point who said, I can't, I'm too busy at work. And the female turned to him and said, if you don't take your paternity leave, then you're signaling that that's a weakness to take paternity leave. And you're not leading by example. And that really, he really took that on, and he took his leave. And I think that again, when you see, you mentioned the corporate, the workplace, you see the broader culture, that will be reflected probably, I would think, in the halls of Congress as well.
I talk about that a lot, where I say one of my spirit animals, one of my heroes is Sally Ride, and she's famous for having said, you can't be what you can't see. And so we try really hard in our job here at my office to try and make sure that you can see all the different things that you can be, not just as a woman, but as a veteran or as an engineer or as an educator, all of those kinds of things. And also I will tell you a quick story as well with my colleagues. When I was on that bus in freshman orientation, this tells you a little bit about our diverse class. I was sitting with another woman, another veteran, and ahead of us were two men, also freshmen, and they were sharing stories about nap time of their infants and bottles and nursing, and the two of us were just amazed at the conversation. That it was so cool that we the women were not having that conversation. It was the newly elected men who were having the conversation about their families, which is really cool. That means that we're making some progress about, worried about getting home from their districts, or being here and not, being home for their kids. And it's really, really nice.
And you need the workplace to validate that too, right? Yeah. As long as, bosses and leaders see that as a positive, that's obviously a huge piece of it.
And I will say one of the things that, speaking to the diversity of the class and also the uniqueness of the experiences that we bring, you spoke about Native American representation. Another example that I can bring out is here in Congress this session, I put forward some legislation on rare earth elements because I'm really interested in the supply chain of those elements and what we need to make our cell phones and satellites work, and national security depends on whether we know where these elements are coming from, and we know who has them and who doesn't have them. And in putting forward that legislation, we were able to find some money by selling off some tungsten, which is one of those rare earth elements. Wow. And that was able to be combined to help begin to pay for paid family leave. And to begin to pay for paid family leave in a Defense Department environment, you were able to bring the Progressive Caucus along, the folks who are a little bit more left of me, because they very much, and we all ought to be interested in paid parental leave or paid family leave. So they were able to be brought on as a coalition and supporters of the DOD legislation. And then when that moved forward into the Senate, understandably in some ways wasn't as interested in paid parental or family leave coming out of the DOD, a budget, even though it was for federal employees. But what was interesting is that it ended up becoming a bit of a honey for Ivanka Trump and for the administration, because they have run on and support paid family leave or paid parental leave. And so in the end, this very strange coalition of folks on the Armed Services Committee, rare earth element interests, paid parental and family leave from the progressives, and the administration ended up with, for the first time ever, 2.1 million federal employees having access to paid 12 weeks of paid parental leave. And that's decades and decades in the making on the backs of a lot of people, including Congresswoman Maloney and my chairman, Mr. Smith. But it just is the kind of a signal of what can happen when you've got sort of weirdness in the air, like rare earth elements.
That's what makes Congress great, right? As a member and a reporter covering it. It's like something that's so bizarre and wonky, but also so fascinating about how things come together like that. That's something people just don't kind of see the background of all the time.
Absolutely, absolutely. I have one more question, and then I'm going to open it up for you for the questions that I'm sure I didn't ask. Who should read this book and why?
So anybody who's interested in what's happening with the Democratic Party and who's watching the primary and who's interested in the outcome of the election period, I think could learn things, because I do think that your class and the 116th Congress was a bit of a dress rehearsal for all of this in terms of how the parties are interacting and intra-party, what's happened to the Republican Party, frankly, what's happening in the Democratic Party, and how we're trying to come together as a country and what some of those internal conflicts are. I think it's an interesting book for young women, so they can see the different paths that different women from a variety of backgrounds have to possibly being in public office. I brought up Sharice Davids earlier, who's Native American, and I said, do you feel the onus? Is it sometimes overwhelming to feel like you are representing this group of people? And she said, yes, in a way, if I think about it. But she said, I have just as many people who come into my office who say, hey, I go to community college, and you went to community college. So they're inspired in that way. So there's so many paths for so many people. And I think some of those paths, whether you're a veteran, whether you're Donna Shalala and you've had an entire career and you're at an age where some people are retiring, you decide to go be a freshman in Congress, you're young, you're old, you're poor, you're rich, you're middle class, you're black, you're white, whatever background you're coming from, there's a path for you. And I think these paths are explained there. So I hope, and anybody who's sort of interested in history, because there is a lot in the chapter of how women kind of began being part of Congress that I think is just sort of fascinating. It was for me to learn.
No, I enjoyed very much the experience of, in some ways, rereading what happened, to me in the last year and a half and to my classmates, and I would encourage other people to read as well. I'm understanding that we are out of time, so you don't get to have the opportunity for your own question, but I really appreciate being able to have the tables turned and to be able to ask questions of you. And if you noticed, 3 times you tried to get me to answer a question.
It's a habit.
So old habits die hard.
25 years.
Yeah, but it's nice to be with you.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards. Please rate and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts.